So I am so happy to be here with Dr. Peter Levine, who's the founder of Somatic Experiencing and a very important pioneer in my own life and work. It was his somatic experiencing model when I encountered it in 2000, but when I trained extensively, that influenced a lot of the work that I've done in creating the yoga and psyche method and changed my approach to psychotherapy. And what I'm really excited about here tonight and into my future is to explore with Peter, to engage a open inquiry and dialogue, to discover new things and explore new perspectives about how the ancient tradition of yoga, that's anywhere from 2,500 to 5,000 years old, intersects and
back in the day.
Yeah, back in the day, a long time ago, as they say, converges, intersects, mutually supports this new technology that Peter, as I'm getting to know him, has for 45 years has deeply devoted his life to uncovering and is continuing to uncover. So that's what we're doing here today and into this weekend, really opening. I've been teaching this. I ran a conference in 2014, bringing people together from all over the world. But as you have this passion to keep going, I want to keep growing, and to be able to do that even for a short period of time with you is really.
Okay.
And I also, what I found quite unique in the training that I did in your work was that there was an empowerment around it. Not to be
Indeed.
Careless and
Sure.
and not do due diligence, but to go take this approach, right, and apply it and explore.
Yeah.
So that's, I took that as a very real invitation. And when I was in your 3-year program, because I had many years in as a psychotherapist and many years as a yoga teacher, I had this question about the intersection of the traditions. So I would bring my experiments to my to all the consultations we needed to do and all the sessions, and I would give my supervisors these exercises and say, "Can I try this on you? Will you try this on me?" And we were just unpacking
Great. Get 'em
these
hooked.
things. So some of my questions, we'll get into that a little bit later, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So maybe as a beginning, when I sat in my training, I immediately experienced somatic experiencing as a spiritual practice. It was like I trained in tantric yoga and tantric Buddhism, and I would listen and do these practices, and I thought it was like an alchemical transformation of the body.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly it has a spiritual dimension. And ultimately, for me, healing trauma is not about erasing memories or desensitizing, but really is a transformative process. And I think that this really parallels in some ways, or is a portal, maybe best said, to different types of spiritual awakenings and also to spiritual disciplines. So while people come because of their trauma, in learning to really meet their trauma and process it, but not overly process, but to be able to meet it and then to let go, and then to move into a more empowered, more open place.
Yeah, and right, this tantric perspective is unlike the transcendent perspectives. Right, it's about using all of life for transformational purposes, and
Yes, indeed.
And right, the human longing to become, like when I think when really beautiful somatic experiencing is practiced, and you modeled it so beautifully this weekend, to become, when we become one with, right, whatever it is, even if it's deep trauma, right, there's so much that opens, right, and that's, I guess, what I experience as essentially, we could call it ordinary or healing or mystical, but it's a oneness experience of this world.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a paradoxical. On the one hand, it's being able to step back and experience, observe the different sensations and feelings and images that are associated with our trauma, and to meet them, and then to connect to them in a way that it automatically changes, that it automatically shifts, that we find that we're not stuck in these responses, that they can move fluidly one into another. And this process, I think, is similar to different spiritual disciplines, whether it's a tantric approach, a Zen approach, of really learning to stay focused, a kundalini approach of accessing these deep energies. Because trauma is about evoking these intense survival energies, but they don't get the complete. We get stuck with them. But as we're able to access these energies, to experience them in our bodies, then through that experiencing, we open to what in Kundalini is the root chakra. So because that's the survival responses are the root energies. They're I think, I don't know if they're exactly the same, but they're very they're very close.
Yeah.
I think. And so in being able to be taken by this energy, to be using that energy to open these doors, these portals, in a way that probably is similar to what had happened in millennia ago in Kundalini. There is a difference, though, an important difference. And in the Kundalini, usually the initiate was given a Shakti. They were given this blast of the Kundalini. And when it comes to trauma, you can't do that. You have to access these energies, these experiences, one small amount at a time, what I call titration, and to let them move through. For example, 25, 30 years ago, I was asked to see this young man who, I guess we were all young in those days, who was in a practice, a Kundalini practice in India, and they received Shakti, and he literally would go flying around the room. They had to tell him that he couldn't go on because he was dangerous. He could have hurt somebody. So these energies are powerful. There's the same kind of energy that allows a 90-pound mother to pull a car up and pull her son from under the tire. It's tremendously great, vast energy. And if that energy is released all at once, people are overwhelmed. And in terms of trauma, it was about when we were overwhelmed. And the nervous system really can't tell the difference between the original trauma and having an overwhelming experience again. So that's why it's really important to titrate and to really break this into one piece at a time. And that way, people find they get a similar kind of opening of a eternal now, eternal presence, sometimes experiencing states of quiet bliss. But they do it in a very gradual way. And I think, in a way, trauma has become the great portal to spiritual experiences in our time. I think maybe more than almost anything else.
As a psychotherapist, my specialty is working with trauma on the spiritual path, spiritual emergencies, working with spiritual teachers who have scandals, spiritual communities that fall into crises. So I end up dipping into into the trauma and the spiritual path on a
Right.
weekly basis.
Yeah.
And I've noticed, as I'm sure you, oftentimes, as you just said, in the Western world, a lot of people come to the path because they hear notions of enlightenment, or they taste these openings in yoga classes or early meditation, and there's
Yeah.
some perceived hope that the spiritual
Right.
path will take them away from their suffering, or we hear ideas of
yeah.
enlightenment, transcendence, eternal
Right.
bliss, which is, in my experience, largely projections onto the spiritual path.
Projections. What do you
Well, I think a lot of our notions about what spirituality is going to bring, we hear terms and we imagine that,
mean? Oh, I
that
see.
it
Sure.
will.
Sure.
But that it, right, it's often people with deep wounds that are brought to the path, but of course it's that crack that has opened us and made us longing for more. So we arrive as complex people that we are.
Okay.
And this practice of titration I've used endlessly with clients, but I often get people not when they want to explore, open up, but when the Kundalini has
broken.
right,
Broken
and
through.
in really psychotic states that
Yeah.
have been introduced by unsupervised spiritual practice, or
Right.
spiritual practice gone awry, or just naivete, where we get a taste and
Sure. Well, when it was in the 60s, I mean, that's when everybody was dropping acid. And many people, could not handle those energies, and they did go at least transiently psychotic.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, with people who had that experience, really sort of have to backtrack a little bit, and often what happens is people have a piece of a spiritual experience, and they that's all they want to have, and they deny other more shadowy feelings, and I think sometimes that's been called the bliss bypass, where it's quite seductive, but when that happens without really getting a grounding in the body, and in also some of our different feelings and emotions, that it becomes a way of avoiding these uncomfortable feelings.
This
And it always does catch up with people.
That's right. There's no shortcuts, right, to
No.
integration. So I'll backtrack a little bit here, and well, actually, one question I was interested in, because you refer a lot to spirituality, which wasn't when your trainers teach; it's much less talked about. Were these traditions informative in your own development,
Different
or the
spiritual
development
traditions?
of your work?
I think what's probably more true is, as I was developing SE in the 70s, people were having these experiences, and these experiences were not what normal psychological experiences. So, I started to pursue and try to find out where these experiences could be coming from, what they were like. And in doing that, I studied, at least to some degree, some different disciplines. I also want to say that when you have a breakthrough in working with trauma, that in itself isn't a spiritual path. It can be a beginning of a path, an opening of a path. So, so anyhow, I became interested. Particularly, it was clear to me that this had some relationship to Tibetan Buddhism. And so I spoke to some different lamas, and they actually gave me some really interesting historical information.
Right. I mean, that's why the Tibetan Buddhism is the tantric approach to Hindu Tantra and Tibetan Buddhist Tantra. It's that alchemical approach that takes things in and through, as opposed to transcending.
Yeah.
I mean, later on, or at another level, working with deeper levels.
Right, as they say
but there seems such a profound relationship in my life's work and understanding to date between the deep somatic psychological work and the mystical unfolding. I often see this infinity sign in my mind when I'm working with it, because let's say for meditation, for example, many traumatized people, when you get into deep meditation and things get too quiet, right, or you start entering these void places, there's huge blocks often for many years, because the void is scary, and emptiness is scary, and quiet is a place where something bad might happen. And then when working with those states of trauma and working with those states psychologically, it influences the quality of spiritual practice. And then
I think when people for the first time close their eyes to meditate, people who have had trauma, which is a lot of people, two things happen. Either they bang into the trauma and they're just sucked down into that black hole, to that vortex, or they start coming to contact with it and they split off, they dissociate from it. So it's really a task of meditation teachers, for example, of how to be there for their clients.
Yeah,
because that's going to happen when you close your eyes and go inside and you don't have the gazillion distractions and all of the devices and so forth.
Right.
You're going to find out what's there is there.
Yeah, so it's another really hot point for yoga, and even if we take it into the level of, when I think of, when I say yoga, for me, I see breath work and meditation and asana and service and livelihood, but most meditation teachers and most yoga teachers have no training in psychology, no training in somatics, because it's not only meditation, right? You go into a yoga class and you start unwinding the body. And why I teach yoga teachers about this is because very often the only instruction that, I've been to a bazillion yoga classes. I love to go to different teachers. I think each have their jewels. But the only instruction given to work with psychological states is breathe. When something comes up, breathe. You're always welcome to go into child's pose. And maybe we can get into a little bit now how I've been integrating it with asana for many years, because most teachers will say, you said you do some yoga practice. You're welcome to go to child's pose if you need it. But many people anyway have a difficult time giving themselves permission to do it.
Right. One of the really useful things about yoga is that in trauma, the body has become the enemy, because that's where all of these feelings and these sensations are rooted. And now they become the enemy. They feel like the body has betrayed them. And of course, really, the healing has to occur through the vehicle of the living body, the sensate living body. So, approaches which help people beginning to connect to their body sense are very useful, and yoga does it in a very physical way. I think the pitfalls can be that that some people, they get into yoga almost in a compulsive way. They have to, make bigger and bigger in stretches, and sometimes actually hurt themselves because they're so desperate to come back into their body. So a teacher who has some understanding of what happens in trauma in the body is, and it maybe even has an approach which is more allowing rather than doing, because rather these poses, for me, are kind of, they're archetypes. And the important thing is not that you can, and what?
They're like invitations. They're
invitations,
like little locked envelopes that are
I think
inviting us.
The idea is to take it as an invitation, not as a as a dogma or as
something to achieve.
Something to achieve, and to, you know, really just like push into pain, because with trauma it doesn't generally work. You know, the no pain, no gain thing really doesn't work. I don't know if it really works for very much of anything, but it certainly doesn't work for trauma. So I think having a teacher who has awareness, has a psychological dimensionality to their own development, their own work, and particularly a trauma-informed in terms of a body-based approach, I think they're much more able to be effective teachers and guides for their students.
Yeah, and they're able to teach more than asana. You know, they're able to help students unpack the images and sensations and emotions in the body.
Yeah.
So some of, you know, to take it a step further, when I've been teaching these yoga and psyche trainings, I'll take the actual, you know, some of the core techniques is what I want to do on Sunday, of resourcing and pendulation and titration into the asana. So having people go to where they usually go, what they perceive as the right pose, and back, you know, really back out to where they can still, just like the basic.
Back out to where?
Back out to where they can still feel the emotional, physio-emotional impression of the pose, but where it's causing no stress.
Yeah, that's right.
And then start to pay attention to your Psyche model, the sensations and images and memories.
A field of experience.
And then going back in, and then oftentimes seeing the difference when you have support and hands-on and holding, and in that way, for yogaphiles, as those who are just those like yoga nerds we call ourselves sometimes, where you just can't get enough. It's a lifelong passion. It's hobby. It's fun. It's path. It's the whole thing. But for those who just want to keep exploring. And I mean, it's like a whole, your method, and I'm sure other profound methods, but I've studied in your tradition, it offers this tool to open up in the body, right? Trauma and not trauma, just knowledge, right? Awareness and understanding. So I found, you know, I really took that invitation from the trainers personally, like take it into your life, and it's a tool without end. Yeah. That I'd like to see the yoga community getting excited about. I think it's
an endless exploration. And in the quatrains of T.S. Eliot, right, we travel all the way around the world and then come back and know our home for the first time.
I mean, when you describe this, yoga has a brilliant psychology, right? This huge tradition, but that vast yogic psychology wasn't developed in the Western world at a time when these types and qualities of trauma. But that's why the blend, right? That's why the blend, because here you have even the people who come to me, avid practitioners of yoga, people who have put in 20, 30 years to the path, and they're coming, you know, by the time I see people, they're often saying, you know, I've put in 10 or 20 or 30 years into the yogic path or my meditation practice, and still I experience patterns I can't change, still I experience depression, still I experience all of the anxiety.
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, the traditions of yoga go back well before there were psychologies the way we see them in the West. And so, in a sense, they weren't designed for a very ego-oriented, self-oriented, in the ego sense, oriented society. And but even if we look at some of these traditions, these religious and spiritual traditions, we often find that they have an intrinsically shadowy part that's not acknowledged.
Yeah.
And I think for that a seeker, they of course can benefit from many of these traditions, but I think it's also important that they develop the discernment to see where their shadow might be getting a little out of hand.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen so much, and of course as a psychotherapist my whole practice is confidential, and I work with lots and lots of teachers and big communities in crisis, and I've come to this conviction that anyone in any role of spiritual authority, it's right, it can never be mandated, but if they would undertake a full course of really intelligent
Exploration,
depth
psychotherapeutic,
you know,
absolutely.
it would really change the course of development of spirituality in the Western world.
I imagine you have so many instances where you really have spiritual trauma because of the abuse of power that a teacher uses because of their position and their power over the students. There have been so many of those. I mean, you can barely keep track of them.
Can you, I don't know, can you say anything more about how you see this issue of spiritual trauma? Because my life is filled with it.
Well, I mean, even more than the parent, teachers, mentors, are some of the most important relationships in our lives, and mentors at many different levels. And the most potentially powerful and then potentially damaging are those that involve spiritual practice, because we are really relying on this person to help us in ways that we don't believe that we're equipped. And so that can be easily used in malevolent ways, in ways
even
that...
unconscious, usually.
Sometimes unconscious, not always.
Yeah.
But you see these things, fall apart.
Having known so many spiritual teachers, I would say most of even the bad ones, or the ones that have caused great difficulty, like it's unacknowledged trauma. Like they're consciously, not all, but many, consciously well-intentioned, but they've come to such positions of power and charisma, right? Largely motivated by overcompensating for need for recognition.
Sure. Well, that's possible.
And then what's getting mixed with truth, as you said, right? There's a lot of very good parts. So their own, we could say in this conversation, trauma or unintegrated past is getting mixed with quite exquisite teachings, and right, it causes this deep confusion.
Yeah, and trauma, spiritual trauma, among the people who are the followers.
Yeah, and in the yoga world, it's epidemic. The leading male yoga teachers often fall one by one. I mean, are great visionaries. Yeah. And maybe I'll ask you one question specifically on this topic, because usually where the teachers fall is in the area of sexuality. It's always money, power, or sexuality.
Right.
With 90% of it being sexuality.
And money and power.
Yeah. But that seems to be where the deepest acting out of something unintegrated happens.
Yeah, more than likely. I mean, you see some of the teachers who really are clean, and they have a very different quality about them. Yeah. But it's hard for people, again, especially because people who have had a lot of trauma are attracted to these disciplines, and they're unable to really see the shadowy part of these people. And then they feel betrayed, and it reinforces betrayal they've had most likely in their childhoods,
Right. And couldn't we even guess or hypothesize that people with trauma are attracted, and just much like intimate relationships, right? Sometimes our neuroses attract each other, so that part of the seeker recognizes something familiar of that part of the teacher, and it's perceived as a yes, but it's actually
right.
It's really
I think that's
the
true.
danger.
I think that's an accurate perception. That a lot of times people are attracted to the teachers because, similar to the way people are attracted, for example, a woman, she'll go, and there's a party, she'll go into the party, and immediately she's attracted to the guy who's a sociopathic, narcissistic type personality. And it just seems like this person is just wonderful and perfect, and this is going to be the love of their life, the true love. So indeed, we are attracted to spiritual teachers in a similar kind of way. It's like, okay, this is the person that really can help us, can give us what we haven't gotten, what we've been longing for all our lives. And we don't realize that this is a lot of what people have to be responsible for their own development. And the idea, I think, of the guru should be more of somebody who's really assisting a person on their path, who recognizes where they are on their path, and then assists them to continue moving forward. I don't know how common that is these days.
What we have in the Western world is many sincere, unconsciously traumatized individuals teaching in the yoga world and proliferating these pristine teachings. I really think often in all sincerity, and that's it's not a problem. I mean, it's where my passion comes for integrating this kind of depth psychological perspective.
Right. I mean, I think anybody who's teaching anything having to do with healing, with yoga, with therapy, needs to be doing perpetually their own work. Because it is an infinite process. And, it's a necessity, a necessary luxury to be doing that.
The breath in somatic experiencing and yoga, for me, if there's anything that physical yoga practice has taught me about in 20 years, it's about how to breathe. And
or how to be breathed.
And how to open. Well, it's an ongoing study of breath. Let's say it's not something that's ever mastered, but it's really the core of practice. And as we were saying, these asanas are anything but achievements. They're invitations to open ourselves to unfold. But you said something very beautiful over the weekend, or maybe it was somebody who I was working with. Oh, you were demonstrating, and you said, I can make myself breathe, but it's not the same as a spontaneous full breath.
Yes, that's right. Again, in Kundalini, a lot of this evocation of the Kundalini is through, these kind of fire breaths. And again, if you have a lot of constriction in this area, you're going to just increase that constriction very likely if you try to do this kind of intense fire breath. And this really contrasts to when a person moves into an experience and the breath just fills them. And rather than take a deep breath. If you're feeling anxious, take a deep breath, which is okay to take a deep breath, to pause for a moment, but really that's not changing things fundamentally.
What would you replace that suggestion with for the...
Instead of take a deep breath?
Yeah, because that's for example, an
maybe
instruction.
just noticing your breath and without trying to change it. Just notice where it feels more open, where it feels constricted, if there's an area where it feels particularly uncomfortable, and just allowing that to just be there and just notice what happens next, or notice what else you're noticing. And in those moments, in this particular course, I discovered that with trauma, is when people they spontaneously have these full, easy breaths, and it's like you can see that they're really like surprised, like, what just happened? I feel so different than I did a moment ago. You know, a couple of the cases that I show, because through photographs and then through a detailed explanation in my book on trauma and memory, is of two clients, one a baby, and the other one an Iraq or Afghanistan vet. You see that moment when that spontaneous breath comes, and then the person just feels so different, and that of course is going to go away. It's going to disappear, but then it comes back, and this allowing for the inner breath, the spontaneous breath. I think that's really the key, and I think that's where people who teach yoga could maybe also be more informed in even their use of language, and just noticing your breath, noticing where it might be constricted, and without trying to change it, just notice what happens simply as you bring your attention, your awareness to it. And I think some of the mindfulness people are using that kind of approach as well.
Yeah. It's a very different approach than what's often taught.
Yeah. Again, either through forced breathing or through taking a deep breath, and you do get that release, but then the tension builds up right away, rather than actually resetting the nervous system. What we call the core response network, which involves spontaneous breath.
Yeah. I do think that when yoga is taught by mature, really somatically aware individuals, that there's some relationship, and again, this is at the edge of my exploration, but between repeated practice and intelligent exploration of breath with movement, and the likelihood of the arising of more fluid breath.
So whether it's that or if it's yoga, the question is how you're using it.
Right.
And I think maybe that's the thought we can leave your viewers with.
So I want to thank you for sharing in this passionate inquiry that I have been engaging with your support, unbeknownst to you, for many, many years. And look forward to continuing it into this weekend and into
I'll keep up the good
years
fight
to come. Yeah.